Hi, welcome to Eat or Not to Eat, where we will discuss foodways and representations of food in literature. Today we have multiple works by Black authors, and we'll be discussing food spaces in those works and how they contribute to our understanding of those works.
We will also be discussing space and place inside many of these works and how they affect the general surrounding and each individual character in a lot of scenarios. Most of the time, our main character will be the focus of our space and place arguments. But from here, we would like to start off with Salvage the Bones. So Salvage the Bones, obviously a novel about an African-American family during the storm of Hurricane Katrina, their journey through the hurricane. And our main character, whose name is Esh, we are following her along her journey through motherhood, when she finds that she's pregnant in the story. So, Salvage the Bones, from my point of view, offered very good insight into the class disparities of the areas during the time of Hurricane Katrina. With Esh's family, they happen to be not very affluent. They can't buy very much food from grocery stores. That's why they grow their own with their own chicken house and their own coop. So they're very sustainable. They have their own animals that they get their own food from rather than going shopping on the daily, like maybe a more affluent family would. So even when they do make this last ditch effort to go to the store, it's already been picked clean because they use it as a last resort and not the first resort. Excuse me, 1 second. Okay. So, what was that? Okay. So even when they decided to break down and go to the stores are already cleared out. It's clear to see that their family dynamic is broken ever since the loss of their mother, and that their family values have shifted away from providing family meals, spending quality time with each other, and they've all just kind of drifted into their own shells. And it's clear to see that this is not a traditional coming of age story or traditional family relationships that you would probably see in a happier novel during happier times. This is a story about Esh's journey through motherhood, which is still a struggle because Esh is so young and this is her first time being pregnant. And of course, she's still a child herself to be having kids. However, the theme of this book is important because it is about family and the importance of caring for one another through hard times, which is conveyed by their slow change in opinion towards each other. So one thing we have is in class, we spoke about how Salvage the Bone fits into the genre of could you pronounce this for me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a weird word. Bildungsroman. I think that's German.
Bildungsroman. So essentially, it's a coming of age novel where the reader and the audience is brought along to witness the unfolding of the young adulthood, which we are very much doing in Ess's journey. And we were wondering how this genre adds to the understanding of the novel, and furthermore, how does it relate to food and its implications of food for the fuel of a growing body?
Absolutely. I think what you touched on about Esh growing into herself at the same time that she's having to navigate motherhood is incredibly important, because when we're faced with the Bildungsroman, we're usually faced with the psychological and physical changes of a character, and to see such a massive roadblock as a pregnancy is sort of not only terrifying but heartbreaking, because it takes away the adolescence. We talked about food in the novel, and I think and scarcity in the novel, and I think one of the most interesting ways that food was portrayed in the novel is that the lack of food and food scarcity corresponded to other sorts of other forms of lack in the Petit's family. One of the things you mentioned was the lack of financial security, as well as the lack of a mother, which then in turn leads to a lack of maternal guidance. And I think the most striking consequence of food scarcity in the novel as it relates to food's function to nourish and growing bodies is Esh's menstrual irregularity. We see that the lack of healthy food impedes her transition into what, for many cisgendered women, signifies the beginning of the discovery of womanhood. In the same way that her menstrual cycle the physical marker of her female body and her public identity as a woman is impeded by her lack of nourishing food, so too, and even more so, does her lack of a strong female figure to look up to impede her emotional transition into womanhood. She does not have a mother to teach her that she is worthy of someone's respect, not because she is someone's sister or daughter, but because she's a person with her own thoughts and projects for herself. And we see this lack of guidance cause her to suffer under Manny's manipulation and neglect because she didn't have her mother there to tell her that she was worthy of someone's undivided respect and attention. Furthermore, lacking the model she needed to guide her through this sort of strange and undefined territory of adolescence, Esha turns to female figures in classical literature, something that I thought was incredibly interesting in the novel, because the figures she points out, Medea, Psyche, and Daphne, they're either malicious or they've had their agency taken away by men. Medea commits filicide as revenge for her husband's disloyalty. Daphne is turned into a laurel, or begs to be turned into a laurel, to prevent her rape by Apollo. And Psyche nearly goes mad with grief after Cupid leaves her because she broke one of the rules of their arrangement, which was that she couldn't look at him. And we see in all of these examples that Esha exalts a female figure that has been ruined by the whims of the men that they loved. Whether expressing their distress through anger or grief, the reactions are placed in extreme binaries which don't express a genuine experience of womanhood, because the people writing these stories were men and they didn't have the lived experience of grief and pain and insecurity that most women face in their girlish years. Going back to the question of genre, and the novel is a Bildungsroman, detailing Skeed and Randall and Esha's coming of age and their physical and psychological development into adulthood, I question how we're meant to interpret Esha's coming of age. When she is just a child, we talked about how she's sort of in this liminality, because she's betwixt and between adolescence and the responsibilities of adulthood, because she is going to be bringing another life into this planet. And sort of ambiguity that arises from this lack of self-definition. She's not a girl yet not a woman because of her circumstances. She's sort of being pushed into adulthood rather than blossoming into womanhood. And I would say that at the end of the novel, we do see a change in her character. She accepts her role as a mother. She fights Manny for his recognition. So she begins to assert her agency and demand the respect of those around her. And I would say that this is the beginning of her ascent into womanhood rather than just adulthood.
Yes, I would agree. I would say the lack of teacher that we see from Ash is the common thing that led to a lot of the situations they were in, that in general just the family went through, just because the loss of their mother, the loss of tradition, the loss of heritage, the loss of guidance is a very big thing. And because of that, you see a lot of things change for the family very fast, and again very fast right after the storm, just because they had to unpack so many years of trauma in such a short period of time, that I believe it led to Esh's growth being exponential rather than rather slow, because the current situation Esh is in is so volatile that she has to grow, like she has to change, otherwise she won't survive. So her looking for mother figures in members like Delphi and a few of the other women you said, I can understand that, because these are women who had to face sudden change and it was do or die for them. If they would not have faced like such a harsh environment, harsh trauma, maybe their change into their next form would have been a lot slower, more gradual, different. But unfortunately, like these powerful, quote unquote powerful men, I don't really know like how real power is defined by them, because it seemed pretty childish whims, but these whims that they had controlled these women's lives, just like the whims of Esh's father, like Baby's daddy. I don't think that's the right term, but the father of her children.
Yeah.
His whims were like he didn't want to take care of the child, but he also wanted to have sexual intercourse, and because of that, there's responsibilities. And of course, Esh stood up to him. And I think that's the big point that shows the change in Esh, is when she stands up to Manny and shows that I'm not going to be like these characters that I picked as my original mother figures, because now I know that I'm a woman and I deserve the respect that I'm gonna have. But again, like you said, these novels are written by men, and it does lack that certain viewpoint of a woman.
Yeah, something you pointed out that I just am now like I didn't realize before was that you pointed out how these classical Greek mythological figures were forced to sort of undergo that change, and that wasn't even something that I had even considered. I sort of just thought, oh wow, they like it was fight or flight, and but it does like they do survive, and I think that this novel is a novel of survival, and so. I think one of the questions we might have posed in class is, is this a happy ending, or is it like, is there possibility of hope with this sort of like equalizing storm, or is it something that's just dismal?
Well, what's your take on it? How do you feel the ending is? Do you think it's a happy ending?
Oh man, to me, I'm still trying to conceive of how someone could survive a storm that brutal and a change that severe whilst undergoing a physical change, a physical and emotional change as big as pregnancy. To me, personally, it's not a happy ending, but it's also not tragic.
Yeah, so I would agree with you. I would not consider this story a happy ending just because we know the full devastation of Katrina. We know the damage, we know the lives lost. We know the impact the storm had. Fortunately for this family, they made it through and they were all alive and like everyone survived. But, for us to like look at this one example in the story and say, oh, this story ended happy. But we can't say that because they lost their home, they lost their dog. They lost like so much that was important to them. They only gained so little back. And this is a snapshot of their lives. We're not getting to see what's going to happen after this. And like, we don't know whether the family couldn't come back from this or whether they had to leave the state. I'm sorry.
Are you all right?
Yeah. My bad. I had to decline somebody's call. Yeah. So like, we don't get to see all that. But like I said, Salvage the Bones was a very good book, very interesting. I think it did provide us with a good viewpoint into certain aspects of the African American diaspora, especially the early motherhood, which does happen for some young women. Unfortunately, I would have loved to have seen this book written by a young African American mother, like who got pregnant at a young age, to see their experience. But of course, you don't always get what you ask for. So I think it's time we moved on to the next book, which would be A Lesson Before Dying. So this was one of my favorites, I'm not gonna lie, just because, again, this is another coming of age story to me. That's one of the viewpoints I saw it from, because we see Grant come in as this young, angry teacher who is unhappy with teaching children and he wants to run away like his parents. But he also dislikes his parents very much, not understanding that he is exactly like them for wanting to run away and not be stuck in a situation that he feels like where he's just both feet in the mud and can't get out. So he'd be abandoning the children and the responsibilities given to him by his community, which you can understand, like it is such a big weight on his shoulders to educate all the children of his community after being educated himself. And then you have Jefferson, a man who's imprisoned and could be compared to a child due to his lack of education and a certain mental state that happens to Jefferson inside the book leads to Jefferson being like a quote unquote child mentally. And as the reader, you get to see Grant learning from the people that he's teaching. So Grant's teaching Jefferson, Grant's teaching these children, Grant's teaching I wouldn't say he's directly teaching, but I would say he's indirectly teaching some ways the women and people around him in his life, just because Grant is an educator and that's what they do. But we get to see Grant change from this young, hot-tempered man into a very cool, grounded, collected person who gets as he's learning from people. Eventually, we no longer see the Grant that we were accustomed to in the beginning. Grant no longer wants to run away and be like his parents. We see Grant transform into an educator and a mentor, and he changes Jefferson's life and the life of these children for the better. So that's part of what I'd like to discuss. And then there's also Jefferson himself, who Jefferson was arrested for a crime that he may or may not have committed. We know that Jefferson was just unfortunately wrong time, wrong space. During the trial, Jefferson's lawyer dehumanized him completely. He called him an uneducated swine, a hog, that there was no benefit for killing the hog because the hog is worthless. Like, all you're getting is food out of it, but it's not a very good meat. It's very tough. So killing a hog for food is one of the last options that people want to do. And that he just dehumanized Jefferson so much that it took a mental toll on Jefferson. And even though Jefferson was uneducated, Jefferson understood that before the trial, he was human. But after the trial, he was not, because they dehumanized Jefferson to the point where he no longer had an option. When it was safe to remind everyone that the jury was all white, so there was almost no chance of Jefferson getting out of any of these convictions, especially during that time, because there is a callback here to space and place and power. So during this time, it was very commonplace for Caucasian people to place their power over African Americans. It's seen when Grant has to enter through the kitchen of the sheriff's house. It's seen when Jefferson is dehumanized. It is seen when almost any instance where there is someone who considers themselves a powerful Caucasian in the story is being introduced to, most of the time, Grant, because they feel like, Grant's education, which education is supposed to be the great equalizer, yet they don't care. They say, just because you're educated, like, we don't have to treat you any better than the rest of them, which then would be African Americans. But we see that, and this is one of the main points I feel about it, is that education is used as power in this story, because Grant allows education to empower Jefferson and himself. Education empowers these children. You see points in the story where the children become ecstatic from learning, and even when they're punished and scolded by Grant, who we understand was almost abusing these children at the very beginning because, like, he just didn't want to be there. And so, we see education allow Jefferson to die in his own way and for Grant to be his own man. And that is part of, like, how I feel education is powerful. And the question I would like to say is, besides, like, the novel recounting the fight for one's humanity and the evolution of the human psyche towards self-accusation, it is largely about namely the lack thereof in the trial of Jefferson, who is wrongly sentenced to death for murder. Being that the novel is featuring quiet what's that word? Do you know?
Poignant.
Poignant moments. I don't know why I couldn't say that word.
No, you're all good.
Moments that occur in food spaces. How would you situate the question of culinary justice as it relates to the plight of the novel?
So I just want to say first, those points that you made, wow, just absolutely. I had never considered that before. I never considered A Lesson Before Dying as a sort of coming of age novel, but hearing you make those points, it's absolutely a coming of age novel. It's a way for someone to undergo such drastic, I guess I wouldn't say physical, but psychological changes due to the situation that was imposed upon them because of the injustice of the society they found themselves in. You talked about the hierarchy of society where because of the construct of race that was essentially constructed because of racism and not the other way around, that a lot of the Black population in these areas suffered under the hands of white people who wanted to benefit from the power structures that were already in place and maintain that power. You talked about how Grant was disrespected, even though he, was an educated man, and I think that that's something that we see today when people they don't want to acknowledge or see Black excellence, and it's something that bothers them because of their inherent racism. And you also talked about the dehumanization of Jefferson in the rhetoric that was used to defend him, which is sort of like paradoxical. It was his own lawyer that said that, trying to defend him. I remember writing down in the book, he was like, the lawyer made a point that was like, if Jefferson was the one who was holding the gun, then why did the person behind him get shot 4 times and Jefferson left without a scratch? And I was like, that's a good point. And then he was like, Jefferson's a hog. And I was like, you just demolished your entire system of logic that you just set up for yourself, because the facts were enough to exonerate Jefferson if this system was just. But because the system was ultimately set up against his favor just because he was Black, he didn't stand a chance. And unfortunately, the lawyer that was meant to defend him and protect Jefferson's rights just ended up feeding into that cycle of oppression and dehumanization. But I do want to talk a little bit about food spaces, just because that is something that is especially poignant in the novel. We see food in A Lesson Before Dying, specifically the food prepared by Miss Emma and brought to Jefferson in the prison, as a vehicle for her to assert her agency in a situation where her voice largely went ignored. It's her way to nourish and provide some sense of normality and comfort, and therefore humanity for her godson, because she was largely unable to fight the injustice and prejudices that led to his false conviction and subsequent imprisonment. Michael Twitty outlined the concept of culinary justice as the idea that historically oppressed peoples have a right to authority, sovereignty, prosperity, and acknowledgement of their contribution to national and global foodways. We discussed in class how the African-American descendants of those who brought Carolina gold rice from Africa are unable to profit from the commercialization and appropriation of that food item, which is in a very fundamental way unjust. Likewise, though perhaps not on such a national scale, food that Miss Emma prepares for Jefferson, or prepares in general, though largely going unnoticed and underappreciated both by Jefferson, but also the Pichot household with which she worked. It later allowed her to justify her conviction that she was owed recognition for her work. Something I thought was incredibly powerful was that she went back to Pichot and she was like, I've done a lot for this family. And absolutely, she was justified in that. It allowed her to justify the conviction that she was owed recognition for her work, for nourishing and feeding the Pichot family, for essentially helping keep their family going. In this way, Miss Emma, whether knowingly or not, asserts her right to culinary justice, her right to be acknowledged for her culinary contribution, and to be recompensed for the labor of her working years by the favor she later asked of Pichot for Grant to be able to visit Jefferson in the prison. And I think she's one of the, even though she's sort of understated and she's quite a quiet lady, well, I guess compared to Talmud, I just think there's something so powerful that she, despite the constraints of white male hegemonic society, especially in the 30s, she finds a way to assert herself, assert her agency, assert her rights, and assert, the fact that she is owed something from this family that she worked so long for. It's in a just system that would have been something that you would have just allowed out of human decency, but this is something that she has to sort of make an argument for. And I think, it's unfortunate that she even has to make that argument, but I think it speaks to her will and her strength. And without that initial action, there would have been no novel. There would have been no catalyst for the events that take place in the novel, for Jefferson's self-actualization, for his attainment of self-worth, as well as the development of Grant's character as finally being able, at the end of the novel, to express powerful emotions through tears in place of the sublimated aggression that he felt towards the humiliation of his expected submission in white society, that he misdirected towards Talmud and Miss Emma. So I just thought that was a very, very powerful act that might go unnoticed because, she's just very understated.
Give me 1 second, please.
Yeah.
So to the point you were making about Miss Emma and foodways, I think it's very important to realize the heritage and the importance of passed down knowledge and the power that holds in this story. Because you see that Miss Emma cooked for the family, the sheriff's family for a long time, and it becomes a tool for her to get him to let them in. And the sheriff kind of has to concede because he can't deny that, oh, she's done so much for my family. And you see that these cooking foodways that they use to cook for these white families are the same foodways that they at one point wanted to get rid of during early slavery, or during slavery in general, not necessarily early slavery. They wanted to get rid of them because they thought that African Americans needed to be re-educated and they had to learn new ways of living that weren't African. And you see that African Americans in resistance, they would use the Caucasian foodways and African American food, or the African foodways, and mix them together. And these are the foodways we have now that have been passed all the way down to Miss Emma, for Miss Emma to cook for that family, for to be, essentially what I'm trying to say is the knowledge of cooking is the power that she held on to, which had been passed through generation and generation, and enabled her to get leverage to be able for Grant to educate Jefferson. So it's a long, convoluted line of education is power, and just knowing, even if it's not book knowledge, the knowledge of cooking these foods ended up paying off for this family. And I just thought that was really cool and important to see, it's not just book smarts that are going to take you everywhere in life. Sometimes you need to know some skills that other people would just consider too much. Some people go to restaurants to eat because they don't want to cook. Well, sometimes you need to learn to cook.
No, I think, yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with you. And, I really appreciate that you're bringing up this idea that cooking is a skill that is another type of knowledge that should be as valued as other types of formalized or types of knowledge that might come through formalized education, which is something that reminds me of Mama Day, which is our third novel.
I want to say, before we got to Mama Day, though, I would like to talk about Black Kids Black Ink, because I do know that both of us do have very large sections on Mama Day, and we could go on forever. And just in case, I would like to talk about Black Kids Black Ink.
Of course.
So, Black Kids Black Ink is the film that we watched in the course, and it's all about the African American family and the diaspora that we see across America that every African American family usually faces. So Black Kids Black Ink is about the struggles that African Americans go through, and it does an excellent job of conveying those struggles, which are not simple in themselves, but it simplifies them down for everyone to understand. And I did see on yours that you talked about feminism, and on mine I talked about masculinity. I think that was a rather coincidence that just happened to happen. So the main part I found interesting was the African American males and masculinity, because the African American male in society feels so emasculated because they cannot express emotions. And all of this lack of emotion creates a rift between the father and their children, creating a bad cycle to continue for the children of the father to no longer express emotion to their children, and so on and so forth, creating a very bad cycle that has to be broken by someone in the chain, and it doesn't always get broken, perpetuating the cycle. So the feeling of losing the manhood stems from slavery, when when African American families were given the ideas of the European standard of family. So Africans were brought to America, and a lot of the times the men were demasculated by slavery just because the slave owners or the slave hands didn't want the men to feel powerful and have a chance to rise up and rebel. And then you see after slavery, when the mother had been put in charge of the household and in charge of the kids, and the grandmother and all that had all the power in the slave family, well, bam, you're no longer slaves anymore, and men need to be the head of the household, because that's what Europeans preach. They preached that the men were the head of the household, the men earned bread for the family, and they took care of the family, they protected the family. But this wasn't the system of the African American slave, because they were matriarchal. It's pretty much how they ran things on the slave farm to keep them in check. But one thing I would like to mention that's not uncommon is which I'll bring this up later in Mama Day, so I'm gonna leave that point actually, But you do see that society was forcing the men into a situation, and their response to it was not a healthy one. They chose to break down, they chose to use bravado as the answer for everything, because they couldn't get jobs because the system was stacked against them. They couldn't maintain the job, or they couldn't stay out of jail because this is just how the system was set up. And the story of Black is Black Ain't conveys it really well, of how the family structure around the men in the family is easily broken down nowadays because society is set up to go against it.
Absolutely.
And we do have a question about that as well. I am so sorry, I did not mean to interrupt you.
No. I was just gonna respond to what what you were saying, and absolutely.
Oh, no. Please respond, please. I forgot the question.
I was just gonna say, before watching Black is Black Ain't, I sort of was introduced to the idea of masculinity in the Black community as something that was a question of tension, especially because of the sort of strict confines of what it means to be a Black man, especially a Black man in America. When you have these stereotypes of oh man, a man needs to be, he needs to have virility, he needs to be powerful, he needs to be the head of a household, he needs to be able to provide, he needs to, I think one of the things, he needs to go out and be promiscuous or have as many women as he can, which is sort of like the inverse of what is expected of women, especially of Black women. And I thought that was interesting, the point you brought up, that many traditionally African societies were matriarchal, because I did not know that. And I think that's something that's so powerful, because we see in these novels, well, at least we see in Mama Day and in Soul Food and sorry, I blanked. And in A Lesson Before Dying, we see these very strong matriarchs who assert themselves and assert their agency. And then to know that has a connection to African traditions, that makes it even more powerful to me, because it's a continuation, regardless of the ways in which European or Western society has tried to impose the patriarchy on them. Incredibly an interesting point. Some of the things I loved about Black is Black Ain't is that while it talked about masculinity, it also talked about femininity and feminism. There are a lot of feminist implications I noticed, specifically with the sections that featured civil rights activist and scholar Angela Davis, who spoke about her own experiences of feeling excluded, feeling a lack of solidarity from the Black men beside whom she protested and advocated with justice for, and for equal treatment. I think this isolation that she speaks on, this exclusion from a group that one should typically have access to, speaks to the idea of intersectionality. I think we briefly mentioned this in class as it pertains to the lived experience of Black women. First learned about intersectionality last semester, and it's a term that was outlined by a law professor named Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, and it was first used to talk about the intersections of oppressions of race, gender, and class experienced by Black women in the workplace. And today, I think it's sort of generally used to talk about the ways in which the convergence of social identities produce disadvantages that cannot be disentangled and are sometimes doubly oppressive, specifically for Black women who face oppressions of Blackness and of womanhood. And I think the conversation on Black masculinity must be followed with an acknowledgement of the ways that Black masculinity and the ways that you said that the confines of masculinity causes them to act out in ways that are harmful. I think that's incredibly important to note, because that affects Black women in their families, because the most disadvantaged people in a family that is, or in a society that is patriarchal, are the women who face the brunt of male anger, of male frustration. And I think because we talked, just because to bring in the idea of food again is, these are so many, like, these are such complexities. These are such complex identities and problems and ways of existence that aren't necessarily congruous, but they make up part of a whole. There isn't one identifying facet of Black identity that exists, because Black identity is complex and entangled with so many different histories and so many different stories and so many different experiences, much the same way that the sort of linking motif of gumbo is one bubbling pot, but the individual contributions remain distinct and identifiable. I think it speaks on the way that Black identity resists homogeneity, and that it's important to talk about these different ways that different aspects of identity converge.
Yeah, so I would agree with pretty, like, everything you're saying, because I would agree that African American women are, you can hear me correct?
Yes.
Okay, making sure. African women are the forgotten class. Like, they just don't have to deal with being a woman, they have to deal with being a Black woman, which means that while the men are feeling forgotten, the men are also not women, because the men don't have to, in the European standard society, which they had to fall into because this is where they are, which resisting against that is a lot harder than it would have been in certain times, because the standard was pushed on them so hard, is that, the men understand that, oh, I have to be the head of the household, instead of just accepting that they don't have to be. And now they come home and they take out the angers of not being able to hold a job on their wife, while their wife is still having to maintain the family home. She can't go out and she can't cheat, because it's such blasphemy for a woman to sleep around with other men. But if he should so happen to cheat, she needs to forgive him and make sure that she maintains a stable home. I would just say that the film Black Is, Black Ain't is probably the best learning tool of this course for me. Because, like, after watching the film, and I do African American studies, I'm double majoring in poli-sci and African American studies. So while I'm no expert, I do know quite more than the average person. And this film actually helped educate me a lot on, like, the Black diaspora, and it gave me a lot of insight into these other books and allowed me to look through a different lens. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. And allowed me to look through a different lens and just be able to scope in what was really important. And it's so hard, because after watching this film, you see the larger lens that everything is. There's so many ways to look at each individual situation, and it's almost overwhelming at some point to try and focus on one, because you feel like you're leaving something out, and you don't want to leave anything out, because there's so much to unpack in all these stories. I want to say, and that's why, like, I believe, like, Black Is, Black Ain't is probably the best teaching tool of this course, and one of my favorite things to work on, because it did such a great job in so many simple terms in outlining almost every major theme of this book, of every book almost. And with that, like, we lead into, like, one of the best books we read, which was Mama Day. Mama Day, I'm not going to give you a short description or a short summary, because you just really can't do a short description or summary on it. But one of the things I found really interesting in Mama Day was the mysticism that every character was designed with, especially the Day family themselves. Like, I often found myself, like, reading over the story and just glancing over the supernatural, because Naylor just incorporated them so well into the novel. Like, the supernatural events that would happen would seem normal, and you're just like, oh, well, that happens in everyday life, even though, like, oh, you're supposed to pause. Like, no one's gets sent magic letters. It just doesn't happen. So you often have to reread the line. I often found myself rereading the line, like, once or twice to, like, make sure what I was reading was happening in the novel. Give me 1 second. Okay. And then so, you get to see, like, the power of the Day family, the magic they possess is such a strong thing. It's something that governments would probably fight for if they knew about it. And, this is controlled by a strong line of matriarchs, which like we mentioned earlier, is not uncommon to find in African American families or the African household, because matriarchs is just how they lived. Like, they understood that women could be powerful in the family and lead the household. And the story is based in Georgia. Georgia has one of the larger populations of African American families. And at that, like, Georgia was a slave state. So what came to my mind was the religion of voodoo, because voodoo is a mix of plenty of religions, that most of them being African and a little bit of Christianity. So with the slaves taking their opportunity to resist by making their own new thing, instead of just completely accepting Christianity, they would practice voodoo instead of practicing Christianity, because Christianity would mean submitting to the white man instead of submitting to themselves and being their own ruler. So little forms of resistance like that. And that's what I found in Mama Day, because I felt like the magic they possessed was akin to voodoo. Not saying that it is voodoo, but it's akin to it. And the ability to mix like other people's cultures into literature is so important, because it provides people an understanding and like a window, like a little snapshot into these traditional spaces that they otherwise don't have access to. And it gets people intrigued and interested. And now they're thinking, oh, I need to learn about this because this character is so strong and powerful. Like, I just need to be able to know where this comes from. I think that was important to know. And then also you see, like, as we mentioned earlier, like, this is a matriarchal family. Like, you don't really see the husbands of Mama Day. You don't see the husband of, is her name Miranda?
Yeah, Miranda.
Yeah, so you don't.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, yeah, but you know who I'm saying, the sister of Mama Day. You don't get to see their husbands around at all, or are they even mentioned in the book? I don't even remember.
Yeah, so Abigail's husband died, and Miranda was never actually married. Miranda is Mama Day, but yeah, so they out of the picture. They're just not there.
Okay, yeah. It's been a second since you read this book. Their character names slipped my mind. But yeah, it's like the men of these stories, they're not even in the picture at all. So like the strong patriarchal families are like, they're not here. So like Coco is the next in line to lead these families. And it's very important because she's carrying on more than just, the first generation. This is a long generation we're talking about. Like, this has been practiced for generation after generation after generation. It's just, each one's a strong matriarchal figure. So it wasn't surprising to me that Mama Day was doing everything in her power to ensure that Coco was coming home. It's like to take her rightful place as the powerful head of the family. And even though like we may view it wrong because our generation has an understanding of follow your own dreams, like them themselves is a different story, different situation. And the final point I would like to bring up before I ask my final question would be the focus on the limitations and like the limitations of science, because the George, Coco's boyfriend, he's a mathematician for all intents and purposes. And if you don't know anything about mathematicians, they're like all about numbers and logic, and that's all they think about is logic, science. If it doesn't meet the logical science view, like you just can't accept it. It just won't happen. So for George to become infatuated with Coco and for them to get in a relationship is bringing together two complete opposites that just don't meld. And for this, I think this is really the reason why George dies, is because George can no longer accept that. George starts to believe, or what I won't even say believe, he has faith in the magic that the Day family possesses at some point. And this is questionable to him because George is a creature of habit and of logic. And when George starts to question his logical thinking, instead of believing in the faith that Mama had given him, he dies for it. And, after that, I would like to pose some questions about it, because it's like, So in Mama Day, there's a pattern of set binaries, whether that be good or evil, or the foolishness and wisdom that we see in the dichotomy forming the backbone of the novel. One such binary seems to be of the socially gendered spheres of knowledge and power, Taking that into consideration, Mama Day and George's disagreement regarding Coco's cure, it seems to be that George and Mama Day are set up as antithesis for each other. In your opinion, what is the meaning that is added to the novel by George's death? Furthermore, contrary to the end of The Tempest, on which Naylor drew inspiration, would you classify the end of Mama Day as a comedy or a tragedy? And what does this departure, if one exists, communicate?
First of all, I just wanted to say, I didn't even consider the idea that the marriage of George and Coco was this bringing together of two opposites and two worlds. Just because I thought that they went together so well, it was sort of easy to gloss over their differences, but they are very different. It reminds me of this, and because we know that Naylor was so inspired by Shakespeare, it reminds me of this Shakespearean term, discordia concors, where it's this idea that opposites can come together and be just as harmonious, or maybe even more so than figures that are more alike. And one of the things that you brought up that I thought is interesting to talk about is this binary between knowledges and sort of which knowledge is valuable in our society. George is an engineer. He loves math, he loves logic, but he also loves Shakespeare. And so that's sort of not necessarily a reversal of our expectations, but it surprises us a little bit. Other than just being sort of besides being rational and logical and based in empiricism, I would say more broadly, he sort of is influenced by this sort of Western education that he's gotten. I think he went to an Ivy League too, so that's pretty cool. He put himself through an Ivy League. But to answer the question, one of the things I love most about Mama Day, and I love Mama Day, was that it played on these dichotomies, but that it wasn't simple or exaggerated. In the novel, we see characters like Ruby and Mama Day and George, or Mama Day and Dr. Smithfield, who are foiled. And these are characters that clash due to differing ideologies, but sometimes they're characters who entertain a sense of agreement. And I think it adds to a sort of ambiguity and richness to the novel, because the foil isn't clear cut, and we aren't sure who, if anyone at all, poses the greatest threat to the Day family and Mama Day's authority on the island, though it seems obvious at the end that it's Ruby. I would say that Naylor leaves a lot of the connections to be made by the reader, depending on what reading they want to support. Again, I think the foil between Ruby and Mama Day is the clearest and corresponds most to the greatest threat posed in The Tempest, which was Naylor's material for her inversion. But regarding the dichotomy of gendered ideas and knowledge and power, I think the foil between Mama Day and George is not only fascinating to consider, but it offers a commentary on the undue value we place on formal and westernized education, simply because it reinforces the structures of power held by men. In the beginning of the novel, it opens up with a series of contradictions, which either confuse us or amuse us or remind us of the subjectivity involved in the creation, proliferation, and designation of myth, and the inherent ambiguity of the truth, especially when the truth involves the subjective experience of multiple people. Somehow in the span of a year, Sapphira Wade married and killed Bascom Wade, and yet she managed to bear him 7 sons. And somehow it makes perfect sense that George meets up to talk with George in Willow Springs, even though they don't say a word, and Remus Boy could hear everything he needs to know about 18 and 23. It's just, I remember reading that and just being like, hold up, let me read that again. And it's just, it's sort of, it sets up the novel as something that's mystic and sort of against our expectations. There are the initial criticisms against Remus Boy as he conducts his ethnography, which introduces the trope of the learned fool that we talked about, which is then revisited when the story of George's death unfolds. Remus Boy, like George, is a man who received a formal education on the mainland. When he returns, he does so with the intentions to record his ethnography of Willow Springs, his written account of the culture, history, and society there, whilst ethnographies have the expectation of being objective accounts. Remus Boy, in his published book, passes his own judgment and interpretation of the meaning on 18 and 23, And though his analysis of the term is not unflattering, he speaks about a people and a culture he is now distanced from because of the valorization of formal knowledge over true understanding and lived experience of the people and culture of Willow Springs. These contradictions set up the events of the novel as taking place beyond our socially accepted parameters of what is normal, and signals that something is about to be changed about our way of thinking. It also signals, in multiple references to The Tempest, that the novel is about reconciliation, either in regard to the healing of familial bonds, as in the case of Shakespeare's version, or as I postulate, between two modes of thinking, and that we've talked about, the more masculine vein of thought, ideas of knowledge which hinge upon the empirical, the physical, the measurable, and the rational, and the opposite vein of thinking, which is just as valuable, the knowledge and life force that Mamadé holds, the feminine pattern knowledge resting in intuition, convergence with nature, collaboration, and communication with others. Nearing the end of the novel, when Mamadé's resources to help Coco on her own are exhausted, she reaches out to George for help, and they reveal themselves as unexpected foils for each other. Both are frustrated with their helplessness. I think the section, there's a page, I think it was like 285-ish. It sums up the dichotomy of monologists helped by both Mamadé and George. I have like a little quotation here. In all her years, she could count on half of her fingers folks she'd met with a will like his. He believes in himself, deep within himself, because he ain't ever had a choice. And he keeps it protected down in his center. But she needs that belief buried in George. Of his own accord, he must hand it over to her. She needs his hand in hers so she can connect it up with all the believing that had gone before. She needed George, but George did not need her. The days were all rooted to the other place, but that boy had his own place within him, and she sees as a way he could do it alone. But no, she won't even think on that. So it's quite a bit to unpack, but I think it's interesting to start with saying that the reason George holds so strongly to his reason and his beliefs is because it's been the source of his success in life, coming from nothing, being nameless, growing up in an orphanage or a boys' home, and then putting himself through his education, building his own engineering company. It's hard to look on those feats and not feel a sense of pride and self-sufficiency. Miranda acknowledges this, and she acknowledges too that there was an alternate way for him to heal Coco on his own, but the solution is so uncomfortable that she doesn't let herself think about it. And so I think that's interesting because we spoke about the necessity of George's death to pay for Coco to live. One possibility we mentioned was that his death was necessary for Coco to live, and either way he was going to die. Whether he sort of went along with Mamadé's ritual or if he did it himself. And I think the other possibility, and the one that's hinted in this excerpt, is that he had a choice. It was a choice. His death was a choice that resulted from his inability to relinquish his worldview, one that upholds empiricism, logic, rationality, formalized education, Western ideals, and the patriarchy, because those things didn't apply in the situation that they were in. Those things held no significance on Willow Springs and on the hex that was going to claim Coco's life. Returning again to Mamadé's links to The Tempest, it's interesting to note that there are some literary scholars that point George as Mamadé's Caliban, because I was just like, wow, that's different. Caliban in The Tempest is this, he's unlearned, he's quite brutish, and of course it's a stereotype. Shakespeare's commenting on the idea of colonization, unfortunately, and it's sort of been analyzed in that vein as pro-colonization, unfortunately. But there are some literary scholars that interpret George as an inversion of Caliban. In The Tempest, Caliban is someone who resists the patriarchy and Prospero's power, but in Mamadé, George is the Caliban who cannot understand or submit to the wisdom and intuition wielded by Mamadé. So it's kind of interesting to consider that. Furthermore, because Naylor references The Tempest in a way that reverses our expectations, it almost seems as if she's saying, in killing George, it's almost as if she's killing the patriarchy, because he's the last male figure that we see that actually has a very significant part in the plot, and that has the power to change things better or for worse for the Day family, to continue the line of matriarchs, if he would give his life for Coco. And I think it's interesting because, you know, even though the end sees all of these instances of pain and grief and suffering that is suffered by women, with Bernice losing Little Caesar, with Coco surviving George's death, but then contemplating suicide. It's hard to see that and then be like, oh, this is comic because they lived. I would say the end of it is likened to Salvage the Bones, where it's sort of like, it's not happy, but it's also not sad. And I would say overall, I have to point out the final page where it sees the sort of attainment of peace and the strength and resilience of the women who have lived through such immense trauma, rather than seeing these characters fold under the weight of grief, rather than seeing them going mad like Ophelia. The end of Mama Day sees these women living with closure and peace because of the measures taken by Miranda or Mama Day. And something interesting to note too is that in the conclusion of The Tempest, the patriarch who has the power, who is Mama Day's foil, Prospero, he relinquishes his powers. He breaks his staff and drowns his book, which are the sources of his power. But in the conclusion of Mama Day, Miranda doesn't really concede her powers, and if anything, she passes it on to Coco. And so it's as if the matriarchy lives, and it's as if this it's an affirmation of feminine power, feminine resilience, and the ability to overcome regardless of the circumstances one finds oneself in. So I was just wondering what you thought about the ending as well, just because it's something that I feel like we could argue forever. Is it happy? Is it sad?
Well, personally, when you bring up the Tempest as the inspiration, which I feel like either I had forgotten or just didn't hear about completely, the what's the name? Sorry.
Oh, Caliban?
Yes, Caliban being George makes perfect sense to me, because, even though I feel like the author used this on purpose, because like, even though George is so educated by European standards, George is super educated, like he fits everything the European standards that would meet. But in the worlds of Mama Day's world, like George is nothing. Like George is a small child. George has not been educated in any of the ways. And, this is all about Coco and her education and her coming of age, and like how she's going to learn to take over the matriarchy. It's not about George and his education and how much value the European world holds into it. I'm sorry, is background noise a problem?
Oh, I can hear you.
Okay, like you can hear me like loud, clear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, making sure. So yeah, it's like I was saying, like George is unproven in Mama Day's world, and I think that was the whole point behind George's choice, was for him to prove that he belonged there with Coco. And since he couldn't prove that he did, he couldn't have the faith to save her. Like, he just couldn't believe hard enough. That's the reason George died. So it makes perfect sense to me for George to be Caliban, because while George is educated and fits the European standards, like to the T of perfect logic reasoning, he just doesn't fit the standards set by the book. And this form of mysticism that we talked about, that the reader just glances over and has to like, whoa, what did I just see? I think that'd been George's response to a lot of this as well. It was like, whoa, what did I just see? And that's why he died, is because, he was like, whoa, what did I just see? And then bam, no more George. So, yeah. So, like you said with Salvage the Bones, I wouldn't say this is a comedy. I would say this is more of a tragedy with a ray of hope. Because, even though George does die, there is a possibility for Coco to continue and live a strong life like Mama Day. But like you said, like the suicide ideation is just, you don't know, because we only have such a small snapshot. We'll never get to see past this and understand like how this truly affected everyone. Like, is Coco going to be able to survive the grief that she feels from the loss of George? Because, it said like George had his own heart and he had his own place in his heart that couldn't move. So we understood that George had a strong core, but Coco didn't have that strong core like George does, or at least it isn't mentioned in the book, because she's broken without him. Like, you see it, like she's contemplating trying to join him in the afterlife. So I just don't think we could consider this book anything but the tragedy it is, with a small ray of hope.
I would say that that's about how I would say it too as well. And it's sort of interesting because if it's an inversion of The Tempest, she could have easily written this as a happy ending, but I think making it a tragedy brings to light the hardships that are faced by women, and I don't know. I think it makes it more serious. I think maybe we wouldn't take Mama Day as seriously if George had not died and if this had not been more tragic. But
there needs to be real consequences for the situation.
Yeah.
But this conversation's been great. I feel like, there's a bunch of reoccurring things that we see in a lot of these, which, learning from each other, because even in this conversation, which, we had set up, but even still, like, we just added more and more on as we went. It was just a good flow. I really enjoyed it. I will say, some of the reoccurring things we do see is the coming of age, which I think in every novel we talked about, there's some way to view it as a coming of age because the main characters are. Also, communication and connectivity, like just the ability to speak to one another, the emotions conveyed through some form of partnership, not like as in like, relationship, but the relationships just individuals have with each other and the communications they have, whether it be actual language or whether it be food ways, like Grant's aunt trying to provide him food as a way for her to give him love, and Grant denying her love by denying her food. You see communication, and all these stories come up, and how valuable it is to people in order for them to continue with their walks of life and how they understand the world. Like, it helps them and pushes them forward. And then the last point I would like to bring up as a reoccurring theme is this whole thing of space, place, and power. Not just space and place, because space and place is a main focus, but power over the space and place is often what I've found in this book. The complicated situation of race is often reflected in how, we understand like America is not perfect, but we do understand like there are some people who are racist, and in some of these spaces it comes out. In most of these novels, it comes up of racist undertones in our backgrounds that you don't have to read about because you understand them from actual history. And you understand the power dynamic that a lot of these people are trying to place on our main characters and essentially put them in their place, like whether it be making them go through a kitchen or, calling them a hog, or, in some of these other novels, it was much worse. Like what was that short story we read where the African-American man in Chi, the young Asian man who no one knew where he was from.
Yeah.
I feel like the young boys who shot his dog, we saw them putting the man in his place by like killing his dog, and they did it for fun, but it really hurt him because that was something he cared about, but they didn't care. So I would just like to point out that one as my last. So space, place, and power. Education is involved in there as well, because education is the great equalizer. And then, is there anything you would like to mention on those reoccurring themes?
Just to say that I 100% agree with those themes. And I really enjoyed this conversation, and I feel like I learned so much from this conversation. And that's one of the things I love about literature, is that, you're never going to be finished reading a book. Every time you read it, you're going to learn something new. Talking about it with different people at different times, you're going to learn something new. So thank you for doing this podcast with me. Had a great time.
Thank you.